A magnitude 6.2 earthquake just tore through the ocean floor in one of the most remote, least visited stretches of water on the entire planet. And within minutes, seismic monitoring stations on multiple continents had already flagged it as significant. That is exactly the kind of headline built to stop your scroll, and I understand why it did. But before you assume this is the next Colombia, the next Indonesia, the next disaster with the death toll climbing hour by hour, stay with me for a few minutes, because the real story here is quite a bit more interesting than the panic version, and understanding it will actually teach you something useful about how earthquakes work in general, not just this one. This happened at Order 822 UTC on August 22nd, 2026, in the Scotia Sea, one of the coldest, most violent, and most sparsely inhabited bodies of water on the planet, sitting between the southern tip of South America and Antarctica itself. The United States Geological Survey and the European Mediterranean Seismological Center both confirmed the same numbers independently. Magnitude 6. 2, a shallow depth of just 10 kilometers, which under normal circumstances would mean stronger shaking directly above the rupture. And yet, if you check the official hazard assessment issued within minutes of the quake, you find something that might surprise you given how alarming the headline sounds. A green alert, the lowest tier on the scale, low likelihood of casualties, low likelihood of damage. So how do you hold both of those facts in your head at once? A genuinely powerful, genuinely shallow magnitude 6. 2 earthquake, significant enough that seismologists worldwide logged it as one of the notable events of the week, and at the same time, essentially zero risk to human life. That apparent contradiction is exactly what this video is going to walk through, because once you understand why this earthquake is fundamentally different from the deadly ones that have dominated headlines this year, you'll understand something genuinely useful about how earthquakes actually work, not just this one, but every one you'll ever hear about again. Let's start with exactly where this happened, because location is doing almost all of the work in this story. The epicenter sat roughly 1,330 kilometers, about 827 miles, east-southeast of Tolwyn, a small town of around 3,000 people in Tierra del Fuego, Argentina. It was even farther from Ushuaia, the southernmost city in Argentina, and often called the southernmost city in the world, sitting about 1,268 kilometers away. Put simply, this earthquake happened in open ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest population center of any real size, in a stretch of water so remote and so hostile that almost nobody lives anywhere near it. That single fact, distance from people, is the single biggest factor determining whether an earthquake becomes a tragedy or a footnote, and it matters more than the raw magnitude number in almost every case. An earthquake by itself doesn't kill people. Buildings falling on people kills people. Infrastructure failing kills people. When there's no infrastructure, no buildings, no dense population anywhere near the epicenter, even a genuinely strong earthquake can pass through almost entirely unnoticed by human civilization, registering only on sensitive instruments thousands of miles away. Compare that directly to what happened in Colombia earlier this month, because the contrast tells you everything. That earthquake, at magnitude 7, 4, significantly larger than this one, struck directly beneath the Chaco region of western Colombia, with shaking reaching a city of more than 2 million people. The death toll there climbed past 329, with thousands more injured and, as of the most recent reporting, hundreds still unaccounted for. Same planet, same year, wildly different outcome. And that difference wasn't really about the raw power released underground. It was almost entirely about what happened to sit directly above that release. Now let's talk about the tectonic setting here, because the Scotia Sea is not some random boring stretch of empty ocean. It's actually one of the more structurally unusual and genuinely fascinating regions in all of plate tectonics. And understanding why helps explain why earthquakes keep showing up here, year after year, largely unnoticed by the rest of the world. The Scotia Sea sits inside the Scotia Plate, a relatively small tectonic plate wedged between the much larger South American Plate and the Antarctic Plate. Small plates like this one tend to be geologically busy, because they're essentially caught in a tug-of-war between their much larger neighbors, getting pulled, stretched, and compressed from multiple directions in ways that larger, more stable plate interiors simply don't experience. The specific boundary where this earthquake occurred is called the South Scotia Ridge, and it runs roughly east to west across the southern part of the sea, forming the boundary between the Scotia Plate and the Antarctic Plate. It is what's known as a left lateral transform boundary, sliding at a rate of roughly 11 millimeters a year. Left lateral means that if you stood on one side of this fault and looked across it, the ground on the opposite side would appear to be sliding to your left. This is pure horizontal sideways motion, not the kind of collision that builds mountains, and not the kind of pulling apart that creates new ocean crust. The two sides are simply grinding past each other sideways, year after year, decade after decade. 11 millimeters a year sounds almost harmless, less than half an inch. But here's the physics that makes slow fault motion genuinely significant over time. Every bit of plate movement that doesn't happen smoothly through continuous creep gets instead stored as elastic energy in the surrounding crust. The fault locks, the plates keep trying to move. Stress builds and builds until the locked section can no longer hold the accumulated strain, and it releases everything at once. Energy that has built up over years or decades in a locked segment gets released in a matter of seconds, and that sudden release is what an earthquake actually is. The longer a section stays locked while the plates keep pushing underneath it, the more energy accumulates, and the larger the eventual earthquake tends to be. This particular stretch of boundary has a documented history worth knowing because it puts this week's event in real context. Go back to 2003 and you find a magnitude 7.6 earthquake that struck along this same South Scotia ridge, felt across much of the southern Atlantic region. Then, a decade later, in November of 2013, the same boundary produced something genuinely remarkable, an earthquake sequence that started with a magnitude 6. 1 on November 13th, escalated to a 6. 8 on November 16th, and then, roughly 30 hours after that, exploded into a magnitude 7. 8 main shock on November 17th. Read those numbers again. 6, 1, then 6, 8, then 7. 8, all within a span of about 4 days. According to the U.S. Geological Survey's own assessment at the time, that kind of escalating foreshock sequence was considered highly unusual for the region, with only around 15 earthquakes above magnitude 5. 0 recorded across that entire stretch of ocean in the preceding 40 years combined. The 2013 rupture spread primarily eastward at roughly 2.5 kilometers per second, lasted around 120 seconds total, and generated aftershocks extending some 250 kilometers along the fault. It remains one of the largest strike-slip earthquakes ever recorded anywhere in the southern hemisphere. So, within a span of just 10 years, this same boundary produced a 7, 6, and then a 7, 8, 2 major earthquakes approaching magnitude 8 on the same fault system a decade apart. And now, 13 years after that last major rupture, the boundary has produced this new sequence starting with a magnitude 5. 7 at roughly 0740 UTC on August 22nd, followed just under 8 hours later by this magnitude 6, 2 at 0822 UTC. The epicenter of this new sequence sits only about 67 kilometers, roughly 42 miles, from where the 2013 magnitude 7, 8 originated. The fault motion is the same pure left lateral strike-slip movement that characterizes every major historical earthquake on this boundary. The depth is shallow, consistent with the 2013 sequence, and the 2 earthquake escalating pattern, a moderate event followed hours later by a stronger one, echoes, at a much smaller scale, the pattern that preceded the 2013 catastrophe. Now, it's worth being very precise and very honest about what that similarity does and doesn't tell you, because this is exactly where sensationalized coverage tends to go wrong. None of this means a magnitude 7, 8 is coming tomorrow or this week or even this year. Nobody can tell you that with any confidence, in earthquake science, as it currently stands, simply does not function as a reliable short-term prediction tool. Anyone telling you otherwise is overstating what the science can actually deliver. What the historical record, the fault mechanics, and the location of this new sequence do tell you is that this is not some random, isolated tremor in a geologically quiet corner of the map. This is a specific type of earthquake on a specific fault, in the same general section of that fault that has produced some of the most powerful strike-slip earthquakes in the southern hemisphere in the modern era. That combination is genuinely worth paying attention to, even without any claim about exactly what happens next. 13 years matters here too, and it's worth understanding why. Fault sections that have stayed locked since their last major rupture have had that entire span of time to accumulate fresh elastic strain from ongoing plate motion. At roughly 11 millimeters a year, 13 years works out to somewhere around 143 millimeters, close to 5.5 inches of total plate motion that either happened gradually through creep or got stored up as locked elastic strain waiting to release. If the section near this week's epicenter is even partially locked, it has had over a decade to reload. The technical details of exactly how the ground moved in this magnitude 6, 2 are revealing too. The moment tensor analysis, the scientific reconstruction of the fault's actual motion, shows fault planes that are nearly perfectly vertical, with dip angles in the high 80-degree range, meaning the fault surface runs almost straight up and down. The direction of slip is extremely close to pure horizontal. In plain terms, the crust on one side of the fault slid sideways past the crust on the other side. It didn't push upward or pull downward, it slid sideways, which is textbook behavior for this specific boundary and mechanically identical to both the 2003 and the 2013 major ruptures. Sideways sliding events like this can, under certain conditions, destabilize adjacent segments of a fault in something resembling a domino effect a phenomenon researchers studying this specific fault boundary have documented directly. When one section releases its stored energy, that stress doesn't simply vanish, it redistributes. Some goes into the surrounding crust as aftershocks, and some transfers to neighboring fault sections that were already under their own accumulated stress, nudging them closer to their own breaking point. That process, known as stress transfer, is a real and well-documented mechanism on segmented fault systems like this one. There's a human dimension to this story too, even in one of the most remote corners of the planet. An Argentine research station on an island in the South Orkney Group, continuously staffed since 1903 and holding the distinction of being Antarctica's longest continuously operating research facility, sits roughly 50 kilometers, about 30 miles from this week's epicenter, home to around a dozen people through the winter and several dozen more during peak summer research season. A separate British research station on a nearby island with more than 2 decades of continuous climate monitoring sits in a similarly close range, typically hosting a handful of scientists during the summer months. These are real people, doing real scientific work, less than 100 miles from where a magnitude 6. 2 struck, not a population center by any stretch, but a reminder that even the most remote places on Earth aren't entirely empty. Let's zoom out now, because this earthquake didn't happen in isolation on some otherwise quiet week for the planet's crust. In roughly the same 24-hour window, monitoring networks worldwide logged this one earthquake at magnitude 6. 2, plus around 9 more between magnitude 5. 0 and 6, 0, more than 50 between 4, 0 and 5, 0, roughly 200 between 3, 0 and 4, 0, and hundreds more below that. That's not an anomaly. That's genuinely close to a typical day on planet Earth, because the crust beneath us sits in a constant, near-continuous state of small releases, shifting fault lines, and settling accumulated stress essentially all the time, almost all of it too minor or too remote to ever be noticed. Multiply a single day like that across an entire year, and you land on a figure that sounds almost unbelievable until you see the data behind it. Roughly 500,000 recorded earthquakes worldwide annually, the overwhelming majority small enough that only sensitive instruments ever register them at all. But zoom out slightly further into the broader stretch of this year, and there is a real pattern worth acknowledging honestly, even if it isn't the dramatic global conspiracy some corners of the internet have been suggesting. Earlier this summer, the Philippines was struck by a magnitude 7. 8 earthquake, one of the largest recorded anywhere in the world this year. Weeks later, Venezuela was hit by 2 powerful earthquakes on the same day, magnitude 7, 2 and 7. 5, a combined disaster whose death toll has since climbed past 6,000 people. In July, Mexico recorded a 7th, 3. Then came Colombia's devastating 7th, 4 in early August. Just days after that, Indonesia was struck by a magnitude 7. 7. 2 days before the Scotia Sea sequence, a magnitude 7. 2 struck southern Peru, and in the days immediately around this event, monitoring stations also logged a magnitude 5. 9 that rattled the greater Tokyo region of Japan early on a Sunday morning, along with additional moderate tremors across Indonesia and activity along the southern mid-Atlantic ridge. So here's the honest, complete answer to the question you're probably already forming. Is the planet genuinely shaking more than it used to? Scientists who track this professionally, using decades of consistent global monitoring data, will tell you there's no solid evidence that Earth has entered some kind of extraordinary period of heightened global seismic activity. The historical average for earthquakes at magnitude 7, 0 or higher, the category capable of true widespread devastation, sits at just under 15 per year, essentially every single year, whether or not any of them happen to strike somewhere densely populated enough to dominate headlines. What genuinely varies from year to year isn't really how often the Earth produces major earthquakes. It's where those earthquakes happen to land, and that single factor, geography relative to population, is overwhelmingly what determines whether an event becomes a global humanitarian crisis or a scientific curiosity, logged quietly by monitoring stations, and largely forgotten within a week. It's also worth being fair to the instinct behind this concern, because it's a genuinely understandable one. When you see the Philippines, then Venezuela, then Mexico, then Colombia, then Peru, then Indonesia, then Japan, then the Scotia Sea, all within the same several-month stretch. Your brain is doing exactly what human brains are built to do, searching for a pattern, a cause, a connective thread that explains why it suddenly feels like the whole planet is shaking at once. But here's the more complicated truth underneath that instinct. Most of these events are not physically connected to each other in any meaningful causal sense. The Scotia Sea sits on the Scotia Plate, wedged between South America and Antarctica. Colombia sits above the boundary between the Nazca and South American plates, thousands of miles to the north. Indonesia and Japan both sit along entirely different segments of the Pacific Ring of Fire, an enormous, separate system of fault lines circling the Pacific Basin. These are different plates, different fault systems, different mechanisms releasing stress that built up independently over years or decades in each specific location. Their clustering within the same calendar year is, according to the actual historical data on global earthquake frequency, well within the range of normal expected variation, not evidence of some singular event unfolding across the entire globe at once. It is worth directly addressing a specific theory that circulates persistently whenever the Scotia Sea makes news: the claim that a major rupture near Antarctica could somehow connect to or trigger the Cascadia subduction zone along the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States. This is not how tectonics works. Cascadia sits on essentially the opposite side of the planet from the South Scotia Ridge. The two systems are geologically distinct, mechanically separate, and connected by nothing more than both happening to sit on the same planet. The seismic energy from even a large earthquake on the South Scotia Ridge cannot travel through thousands of kilometers of ocean floor and meaningfully load a subduction zone on the other side of the world. The physics simply doesn't support it, and no credible seismological research has ever demonstrated a mechanism by which it could happen. What this fault system is genuinely capable of affecting is its own immediate seismic neighborhood, and to a limited extent, its own local tsunami generation potential, which in this specific case is minimized precisely because the fault motion is sideways rather than vertical. Strike-slip earthquakes, where crust slides horizontally rather than thrusting up or down, generally do not displace enough seafloor to generate a significant tsunami, which is exactly why the National Weather Service's Pacific Tsunami Warning Center assessed this event and confirmed no tsunami threat to coastal communities anywhere in the Caribbean or along the South American coastline. Even the 2013 magnitude 7. 8, despite being one of the largest strike-slip earthquakes ever recorded in the Southern Hemisphere, did not generate a significant tsunami for exactly this reason. There's a piece of this story worth understanding because it explains why events like this matter scientifically, even when they cause zero human harm. Every earthquake, no matter how remote, adds another data point to a global monitoring network that has become extraordinarily sophisticated over recent decades. Seismologists don't just log a magnitude and move on. They study how the seismic waves traveled outward from the epicenter, how fast they moved through different layers of rock and ocean floor, and how that specific pattern compares against thousands of previous events in similar tectonic settings. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, there are no land-based instruments actually sitting on the Scotia Plate to directly measure how it's moving. There are no GPS stations, no strain gauges out there. Every bit of what scientists know about how fast stress is building on this boundary comes indirectly from analyzing the earthquakes it produces. That's precisely why an earthquake happening in the middle of nowhere still gets logged, analyzed, and reported on within minutes by serious geological agencies, even though nobody was ever in danger from it. It isn't really about this one earthquake in isolation. It's about maintaining an accurate, continuously updated picture of how the entire planet's crust behaves, region by region, boundary by boundary, so that when an earthquake does eventually happen somewhere with people living directly on top of it, scientists have decades of accumulated data and pattern recognition to draw from, rather than being caught blind by a fault system nobody had been paying attention to. So what are scientists actually watching now in the days immediately following this sequence? 3 things generally. First, the spatial migration of aftershocks. Aftershocks that stay tightly clustered around the initial epicenter suggest a contained rupture releasing local stress. Aftershocks that spread east or west along the boundary would suggest the rupture redistributed stress to adjacent sections, and that those sections are now responding in turn. Second, the focal mechanisms of any events that follow, whether they continue showing the same nearly vertical strike-slip motion seen in this quake, which would confirm the sequence is behaving consistently with the fault's established character, or whether anything shows a different geometry, which could suggest a more complicated stress field. And third, and most significant, whether any future activity in the sequence begins migrating toward the specific sections of the boundary that ruptured in 2003 and 2013, since those segments absorbed enormous slip during those events and have had years since to reload. It also helps to understand exactly why the tsunami question gets assessed so quickly and so confidently, because it's usually the very next thing people worry about the moment they hear the words earthquake and ocean in the same sentence, and it deserves a real, grounded answer rather than a vague reassurance. Several factors typically go into that kind of determination within minutes of an event like this: the earthquake's magnitude, its depth, and critically, the type of fault motion involved. Not every earthquake, even a genuinely strong one happening underwater, actually displaces enough seafloor in the right direction to generate a meaningful wave. Subduction zone earthquakes, where one plate is forced directly underneath another in a specific vertical motion, are the events most capable of producing large tsunamis, because that vertical displacement of the seafloor is exactly what pushes an enormous volume of water upward and outward, the same basic mechanism behind the most devastating tsunamis in recorded history. This earthquake's fault mechanics simply didn't involve that kind of vertical displacement, which is exactly why the assessment came back clean so quickly. That kind of rapid technical evaluation, run within minutes of any earthquake this size occurring anywhere in the ocean, is precisely why Dedicated dumped 2 feet of water onto the windward slopes regardless. That's precisely why the governor said publicly that they were hoping the storm stayed far enough south that the islands would only catch the outer periphery. And then, in the very next breath, he added that there were no promises attached to that hope. The periphery of a storm this physically wide, wrapped around mountains this tall, is simply not a safe place for anyone to be standing. The wind threat was real too, on top of everything else. Hurricane force conditions were expected on the Big Island by Saturday. Tropical storm force conditions were forecast to reach Maui County by Saturday night, then potentially spread to Oahu and Kauai by Sunday morning. And there was one more detail that's easy to overlook, but genuinely critical. Wind speeds measured at the tops of mountains and along steep slopes can run up to 30% stronger than whatever number appears in the official advisory, sometimes even more than that. So the 65 or 70 mile an hour winds rated at sea level become something considerably fiercer the moment you climb in elevation. On top of all of that, the coastline faced its own separate assault. A storm surge of 1 to 3 feet was expected to arrive, layered on top of the normal tide, pushing seawater inland across areas that are typically dry. Hand swells were already building along east-facing shores before the storm had even fully arrived, growing steadily through the weekend and generating what forecasters were calling life-threatening surf and dangerous rip currents. This is really the cruelty baked into a system like this one. It attacks from above with rain, from the side with wind, and from below with rising water, all simultaneously, on a chain of islands where reinforcements can't simply drive in from a neighboring state the way they can almost everywhere else in the country. So the larger loop finally closes here. This is exactly why a storm that never technically reached hurricane strength was enough to put an entire state onto emergency footing. Not because of any single number on a chart, because of everything that single number failed to capture. The rare track that 3 decades of history said shouldn't have been able to reach the islands at all. A wind field so wide that passing offshore stopped, meaning the same thing as passing safely. Mountains tall enough to turn an already dangerous amount of rain into something closer to 2 feet of standing water. And a population that, through absolutely no fault of its own, had simply never had to do any of this before. But as that particular question resolves itself, a smaller and quieter one opens up right behind it. And it's the one that tends to linger the longest. What actually happens after the storm passes? Because the system was mercifully expected to keep moving. Late Sunday into Monday local time, it was forecast to pull away toward the west, likely weakening back down to tropical storm strength as it went. The far western islands might have caught peak gusts somewhere around 50 to 60 miles an hour early Sunday, and then the entire system would begin its exit from the region. That's typically the moment when public attention drifts away. The storm is gone, the story feels finished, the threat reads as over, except it isn't, not really. Because once 2 feet of rain has fallen on already saturated volcanic slopes, the danger doesn't pack up and leave with the clouds. Ground that has been soaking for a day and a half stays dangerously unstable long after the sun comes back out. Streams that were deliberately cleared out ahead of the storm run high for days afterward. And a population that has never once had to rebuild from a hurricane suddenly has to figure out, in real time, what recovery is even supposed to look like. In the days beforehand, the state's Land and Natural Resources Department had already been clearing streams and known flood zones. The National Park Service closed most of the Volcanoes National Park. Schools canceled weekend activities and left Monday itself as an open question mark. Over on the mainland, the same basic pattern held true in its own way. By Wednesday, the storm system responsible for all that severe weather was expected to weaken as it pushed toward the northeast, with little in the way of severe threat left along the east coast. By Thursday and Friday, the forecast simply dissolved into genuine uncertainty, with maybe a bit more severe weather possible over Minnesota and Wisconsin, and a wide margin of doubt surrounding everything beyond that point. Which is, in its own strange way, a kind of honesty. The atmosphere only reveals so much that far in advance. Anyone claiming more certainty than that, this far out, is generally selling you something they can't actually back up. Here's the thought I want to leave you with before we close this out. We tend to measure storms almost entirely by their peak moment. The strongest gust recorded, the lowest pressure reading, the single most violent hour of the entire event. But the people who actually study these systems for a living, the ones drawing the risk zones and standing behind the microphones at those press conferences, they've quietly learned to measure something else entirely. They measure the mismatch between a place and the thing heading straight for it. A modest storm hitting a well-prepared coastline barely registers as a footnote. That same modest storm hitting a coastline that has genuinely forgotten what a hurricane even feels like, wrapped around mountains tall enough to multiply its rainfall several times over, becomes a full-blown emergency. The raw number attached to the storm was never actually the story here. The story was always the collision between that number and everything sitting underneath it, all the history and geography and human unfamiliarity that a wind speed alone can never capture. And that collision is exactly why forecasting matters in the first place, and exactly why the honest voices in this field kept repeating that storms have a habit of turning, not to scare anyone unnecessarily, but to keep people ready for the version of events that the long-term averages simply don't account for. Because the averages said Hawaii would almost certainly be fine. And the averages had been right for 34 consecutive years in a row. 34 years of being consistently right is exactly how a place slowly stops believing something like this can happen to it at all. That's the trap, hiding underneath every long, quiet streak of luck. And that's precisely why you keep watching the sky, even when the map in front of you still looks familiar.